So I'm going to go over Hosea chapter 7, 8, 9, and 10. And this is the ongoing study for Hosea. Those who have watched already have seen that we went through chapters 1 through 3, 4, 5, and 6, and so we continue. I'm reading from the New International Version of the Bible, and I'm going to just go through some notes here, starting in chapter 7, verse 1. Whenever I would heal Israel, the sins of Ephraim are exposed and the crimes of Samaria revealed. Now, again, the sins of Ephraim is one of the 10 northern tribes. In fact, it is the largest of the 10 tribes of Israel. And so it represents that whole northern kingdom in Hosea's language. It's towards the north. And Samaria is the capital of the northern kingdom. They practice deceit. Thieves break into houses. Bandits rob in the streets. But they do not realize that I remember all their evil deeds. Their sins engulf them. Their ways, they are always before me. Verse 3, they delight the king with their wickedness, the princes with their lies. Verse 4, they are all adulterers, burning like an oven whose fire the baker need not stir from kneading of the dough till it rises. Now this is an image back in the day that this was written. People would make bread, they would knead it, and then they would build a fire, and then they had a little oven made of clay. And that's what they would bake their bread in. And so they would put fire in the clay oven, and they would wait for the oven to get hot. And then as they were kneading the bread, they would wait for it to rise while the fire was getting ready. And when the bread was ready to be baked, they would take the fire out, leaving coals in, and then put the bread in there to bake in the hot oven. So that's a reference here when it says burning like an oven whose fire the baker need not stir. It doesn't need to stir it up, it's already hot. Verse 5, on the day of the festival of our king, very likely the king's birthday, the princes become inflamed with wine, and he joins hands with the markers. They all get drunk. Their hearts are like an oven. They approach him with intrigue. Their passion smolders all night. In the morning it blazes like a flaming fire. Verse 7, all of them are hot as an oven. They devour their rulers. Again, this illustration like the oven for baking. It's hot, it's ready to go, it's ready to cook stuff, ready to bake bread. So they're ready to do what is evil. All their kings fall, and none of them calls on me. Verse 8, Ephraim mixes with the nations. Ephraim is like a flat cake not turned over. Half-baked bread. So they would make a thin bread, bake it on one side, then turn it over to bake it on the other side. So it's saying it's just not edible. It's unbaked on half side. Foreigners sap his strength, but he does not realize it. So here the prophet is saying, you're mixed with foreign gods and foreign ways, and you don't understand. Verse 9, his hair is sprinkled with gray, but he does not notice. He's getting old, getting closer to death, but he doesn't realize it. Verse 10, Israel's arrogance testifies against him, but despite all this, he does not return to the Lord his God or search for him. Verse 11, Ephraim is like a dove, easily deceived and senseless. Doves, and those even today, I guess, they can be trapped easily by snares. If you put food out, you can trap a dove. Ephraim is like a dove, easily deceived and senseless, now calling to Egypt, now turning to Assyria. So looking to other nations. Verse 12, when they go, I will throw my net over them. I will pull them down like birds of the air. When I hear them flocking together, I will catch them. Woe to them because they have strayed from me. And so like birds that fly away, and God saying, I got something for you. I'm going to catch you in my snare. Destruction to them because they have rebelled against me. I long to redeem them, but they speak lies against me. They do not cry out to me from their hearts, but wail on their beds. They gather together for grain and new wine, but turn away from me. Verse 15, I trained them and strengthened them, but they plot evil against me. They do not turn to the Most High. They are like a faulty bow. And one commentary I read said it's like an arrow where the bow aims it one way and the arrow goes completely a different way. Like that was by fault. Their leaders will fall by the sword because of their insolent words. For this they will be ridiculed in the land of Egypt. The land of Egypt here may represent slavery. Now, Egypt had controlled part of the land of Canaan at some time. And then to the north of Egypt was Assyria, and stuck in the middle there was Israel. So it may not reference Egypt specifically as a threat. It may just refer to it as the land of slavery to which they will go back. They are going to be enslaved again. Chapter 8, verse 1. Put the trumpet to your lips, a warning, a battle cry. An eagle is over the house of the Lord. Now, another translation would be vulture or buzzard, a bird of prey, not necessarily like a falcon or a bird that catches live prey, but a bird that eats carrion. Because eagles did not grow in this part of the world at that time. Because my people have broken my covenant and rebelled against my law. Now, there's some argument about when and what the people of Israel had as far as the laws of Moses, but there must have been some written law, some part of the Torah, some part of an agreement that they had. And so this was what Hosea is referring to. Verse 2, Israel cries out to me, "O our God, we acknowledge you." But Israel has rejected what is good. An enemy will pursue him. So there was some ritual that they did perform. They would give grain offerings and wine offerings, and they had some parts of this Torah worship that they did follow. But they also had this Canaanite worship that was part of their culture at the time as well. Verse 4, they set up kings without my consent. They choose princes without my approval. This could refer to the time after Jeroboam II, where there were a number of kings that killed off the previous king. And so in quick succession, there was a series of kings that all came and went in the northern tribe, all without consulting the Lord of the God of hosts. With their silver and gold, they make idols for themselves to their own destruction. Chapter 8, verse 5. Throw out your calf idol, O Samaria. My anger burns against them. So once again, as the history shows, when the northern tribes split from Judah, they set up and made a golden calf in Bethel, which ironically means house of God. And so at this new temple, they put this golden calf, which was there all of this time, all along. And so here's a reference saying, throw that out, O Samaria. My anger burns against them. How long will they be incapable of purity? They are from Israel. This calf, a craftsman has made it. It is not God. It will be broken in pieces, that calf of Samaria, the capital of Israel. So there may have been two, one in Samaria and one in Bethel. Chapter 8, verse 7. This is a well-used verse a lot. They sow the wind and reap the whirlwind. The stalk of grain has no head, it will produce no flour. Were it to yield grain, foreigners will swallow it up. Israel is swallowed up. Now she is among the nations like a worthless thing. For they have gone up to Assyria like a wild donkey wandering alone. Ephraim has sold herself to lovers. Now, here usually you have to pay for a lover. Ephraim is selling herself for a lover. Although they had sold themselves among the nation, I will now gather them together. They will begin to waste away under the oppression of the mighty king. So this is a warning in verse 10. Verse 11, though Ephraim build many altars for sin offerings, these have become altars for sinning. There's a play on words here in verse 11. They set up sin offerings, and yet they are altars for sinning. This may be a reference to the sexual cult of the Canaanite gods and goddesses, where they would have these prostitutes as worship to the fertility goddess. Verse 12, I wrote them the many things of my law, but they regarded them as something alien. Again, referencing the written law that they are ignoring. They offer sacrifices given to me, and they eat the meat, but the Lord is not pleased with them. Now he will remember their wickedness and punish their sins. They will return to Egypt. This is a clear reference to slavery and where Egypt and slavery are related. Verse 14, Israel has forgotten his maker and built palaces. Judah has fortified many towns, but I will send fire on their cities that will consume their fortresses. This might be a reference back to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Chapter 9, verse 1, do not rejoice, Israel. Do not be jubilant like the other nations. For you have been unfaithful to your God. You love the wages of a prostitute at every threshing floor. Threshing floors and wine presses will not feed the people. The new wine will fail them. So just, there's going to be some kind of plague, a famine, something that will be taken away as far as food. Verse 4, they will not pour out wine offerings to the Lord, nor will their sacrifices please him. Such sacrifices will be to them like the bread of mourners, bread of sadness, bread of affliction here. All who eat them will be unclean. Mourners would be close to the bodies of the dead, which would be ritually impure. This food will be for themselves. It will not come into the temple of the Lord. It will not have enough to offer the bread, the showbread that they were supposed to put in the temple of the Lord, or the offerings of bread that they intended. Chapter 9, verse 5. What will you do on the day of your appointed feasts, on the festival days of the Lord? Even if they escape from destruction, Egypt will gather them, and Memphis will bury them. Now, Memphis was the site in Egypt a big city in Egypt, in the southern part of Egypt, with a huge cemetery. And so what Hosea is saying here is you're going to die and be buried. Large, large death. Their treasures of silver will be taken over by briars, and thorns will overrun their tents. Verse 7, the days of punishment are coming, the days of reckoning are at hand. Let Israel know this, because your sins are so many and your hostility is so great. The prophet is considered a fool, the inspired man a maniac. So they don't listen to prophets. They consider those people telling God's truth to be fools. Verse 8, the prophet, along with my God, is the watchman over Ephraim. The prophet has been sent to warn, is the watchman. It goes on, yet snares await him on all his paths, and hostility in the house of his God. They have sunk deep into corruption, as in the days of Gibeah. Now, Gibeah references a story back in Judges, where there was a town, the town of Gibeah, where a man went to stay with his concubine, and she was raped and killed. And so there was a great wickedness, and a war ensued. And so there's a reference to the days of Gibeah as a day of inhospitality and rape and murder. God will remember their wickedness and punish them for their sins. Verse 10, when I found Israel, it was like finding grapes in the desert. When I saw your fathers, it was like seeing the early fruit on a fig tree. But when they came to Baal Peor, they consecrated themselves to that shameful idol and became as vile as the thing they loved. Baal Peor is a story in Exodus where the people of Israel are leaving, going through the desert, and the Baal is a prophet who is hired by the king of Moab to curse the Israelites, and he blesses them. He does this 3 times, but he tells Moab, the king, here's a way to trick the Israelites. Have them worship the false gods. And so they started worshiping the god of Baal and turned to the sexual cult of Baal. And so there's this reference. Baal Peor is a time in the Exodus story where this false religion is introduced, and people take up this worship. And then Moses has thousands of them killed for following this false religion. So then, verse 11, Ephraim's glory will fly away like a bird. No birth, no pregnancy, no conception. Even if they rear children, I will bereave them of every one. Woe to them when I turn away from them. So they're going to be, their children, they won't have children. That's a curse. Verse 13, I have seen Ephraim like Tyre. Ephraim and Tyre are close. Tyre is close to Phoenicia. It was a city-state on the Mediterranean. And so there's this comparison of Ephraim and Tyre. I have seen Ephraim like Tyre planted in a pleasant place, but Ephraim will bring out their children to the slayer. Verse 14, give them, O Lord, what will you give them? Give them wombs that miscarry and breasts that are dry. In other words, kill their children. Verse 15, because of all the wickedness in Gilgal, I hated them there. And Gilgal is this place where this city that was where this atrocity occurred. It's also the place where Saul was anointed as king. So it's an ironic place in 2 places of history. Because of their sinful deeds, I will drive them out of my house. I will no longer love them. All of their leaders are rebellious. Now, this is interesting to me because we think of the Lord's loving kindness that never ceases, as Jeremiah says in Lamentations chapter 3, and that if they return to the Lord, God will forgive. And yet here God is saying, I will no longer love them. Remember back in chapter 1, where Hosea says, not my people and not pitied. And so continuing on with that. Verse 16, Ephraim is blighted, their root is withered, they yield no fruit. Even if they bear children, I will slay their cherished offspring. Quite a curse here. 17, my God will reject them because they have not obeyed him. They will be wanderers among the nations. That's the curse. The reason is because they're not obeying the laws of God. On to chapter 10. Israel was a spreading vine, repeating this vine motif. He brought forth fruit for himself. As his fruit increased, he built more altars. As his land increased, he adorned his sacred stones. Now, these altars are apparently altars to the Canaanite gods. Verse 2, chapter 10. Their heart is deceitful, and now they must bear their guilt. The Lord will demolish their altars and destroy their sacred stones. Verse 3, then they will say, we have no king, because we did not revere the Lord. But even if we had a king, what could he do for us? And so there was a period of time in their history where after Moses and Joshua, there was no king. They were ruled by judges up until the days of Samuel the prophet, and then he anointed Saul and then later David. So this could be a reference to God is intended to be their king, and yet they see and they are not following God their king. Chapter 10, verse 4, they make many promises, take false oaths, and make agreements. Therefore lawsuits spring up like poisonous weeds in a plowed field. The people who live in Samaria fear for the calf idol of Beth Aven. Now again, here is the golden calf, and Beth Aven is house of vanity or house of wickedness instead of Beth El, which is the house of God. And so Hosea is saying it's not the house of God, it's the house of vanity or the house of wickedness. And so it goes on, its people will mourn over their golden calf, and so will its idolatrous priests, those who had rejoiced over its splendor, because it is taken from them into exile. Verse 4, it will be carried to Assyria as a tribute for the great king. So this golden calf that you worship is going to be carried away into Assyria, and you will weep. Ephraim will be disgraced. Israel will be ashamed of its wooden idols. Samaria and its king will float away like a twig on the surface of the waters. The high places of wickedness will be destroyed. It is the sin of Israel. So again, these high places on the hilltops where they would have practiced idolatry to the fertility gods. Thorns and thistles will grow up and cover their altars. Then they will say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. Now, you may recognize this. This is in Mark chapter 13 and Matthew, where Jesus predicts the destruction to come and the last days. And the people will say to the hills, fall on us. And so here we see a reference back to this in Hosea. Verse 9, since the days of Gibeah you have sinned, O Israel, since when you had your first king, Saul, and there you have remained. Did not war overtake the evildoers in Gibeah? Once again, referencing the intertribal warfare that came after the man rallied his brothers to go against the Benjamin tribe and to avenge the death of his concubine. And there were thousands and thousands slaughtered in 1 Kings chapter 19, this story that it refers back to. Did not war overtake the evildoers? Verse 10, when I please, I will punish them. Nations will be gathered against them to put them in bonds for their double sin. Again, this reference to slavery. Verse 11, Ephraim is a trained heifer that loves to thresh. And what they would do is they would take their female cows and let them walk on grain to separate the chaff from the wheat. And the cows could stop and eat. In fact, in the Proverbs, there's a proverb that says, do not muzzle the ox when it's treading grain. And so, as opposed to pulling plows, which was hard work for an ox or a cow, they were allowed this easier task. And so cows got used to it and they enjoyed being able to eat and just walk over the grain instead of having to pull a plow. So there's this reference, when I please, I'll punish them. And it says, Ephraim right now is a trained heifer that loves to thresh. I will put a yoke on her fair neck. I will drive Ephraim. Judah must plow, and Jacob must break up the ground. So rather than having this easy life as you've had, you're going to have a hard life. Verse 12, sow for yourselves righteousness, reap the fruit of unfailing love, and break up your unplowed ground. For it is time to seek the Lord until he comes and showers righteousness on you. So here is an opportunity to turn and to return to the Lord. Verse 13, but you have planted wickedness. You have reaped evil. You have eaten the fruit of deception. So this analogy of planting seeds of goodness, they have planted seeds of evil instead. Because you have depended on your own strength and on your many warriors, on their own bows, their own chariots. Verse 14, the roar of battle will rise against your people so that all your fortresses will be devastated. As Shalman devastated Beth Arbel on the day of battle. This is a reference to an Assyrian king who had conquered a city, Beth Arbel, when mothers were dashed to the ground with their children. And the last verse in chapter 10, thus will it happen to you, O Bethel. Again, the capital of the northern kingdom, Bethel. Because your wickedness is great. When that day dawns, the king of Israel will be completely destroyed. Here ends chapter 10 of Hosea for our discussion.